Hey guys, tonight we're wandering into one of the strangest corners of the Middle Ages. A world without coffee, without clocks, and without much calm in the human mind. When life was dark, crowded, and painful, people often turned to the garden, to roots and herbs, to smoke and drink, searching for a little escape. This is boring history for sleep, told slowly, evenly, by your sleepy historian here on Historian Sleepy 365. Over the next 2 hours, we'll drift through the plants, potions, and quiet recipes that gave medieval people strange visions, from henbane that whispered in their dreams, to mandrake roots that screamed when pulled, to belladonna that widened the eyes and blurred the mind. And then far beyond Europe, we'll follow the same trail of smoke and honey through other civilizations before ending with the legacy these forgotten remedies left behind. If you enjoy these long, slow journeys into the past, you can subscribe to Historian Sleepy 365. It helps keep this channel alive, bringing you more boring history for sleep whenever you need to rest. So for now, turn off the lights, let your body sink into the quiet, and let the stories of the old world carry you gently towards sleep. Imagine living in a world without coffee. No alarm clocks, no electric light. Just a dark, thatched house, a fire that goes out easily, and a rhythm of life tied to the crowing of roosters and the sun's slow arc across the sky. It wasn't a minimalist choice, it was the unchanging reality for most of medieval Europe. When you woke in the morning, there was no hissing espresso machine filling the air with warmth and scent. There was only the smell of last night's wood smoke still drifting faintly in the damp air, mixed with the musty tang of dry straw and unwashed clothes. The cold crept up from the clay floor, making your spine ache before you'd done anything at all. And if you thought you might start the day with a sip of fresh water, remember, most village wells were far from clean, and spring water often full of surprises. In that setting, the human mind was never truly quiet. There were no schedules or timetables, just vague intervals, when it was light, when it was dark, when church bells rang faintly from a distance. There were no clocks, but there were constant worries, crop failure, disease, and the kinds of pain that came without painkillers to lean on. When we speak of the medieval nervous system, we don't mean the biology. Neurons then were the same as now, but the way they were tested. Modern people wake up with coffee, a vitamin pill, maybe soft music. A medieval person woke with a dull backache, a new worry about the harvest, and a rooster that crowed and, on some days, flew into the yard as if picking a fight. There were no gentle stimulants to ease into the day. Even white sugar, that sweet thing that helps our brains release dopamine, was a rare luxury from the East, mostly unknown. Instead of caffeine, the only thing that could soothe your nervous system was prayer, or a thin, weak beer called small beer. It wasn't strong enough to make anyone drunk, but it was safer than water. Children drank it, adults drank it. It was the liquid foundation the brain clung to in order to face thirst. But when real pain came, a rotting tooth, a broken bone, a fever that burned, small beer was useless. The village might have had one healer, often doubling as herbalist, apothecary, and sometimes fortune teller. In his medicine pouch were a few dried herbs, a sharp knife used for both slicing bread and lancing boils, and if you were lucky, a bottle of herbal oil for rubbing on joints. The only 2 doses of painkiller in the whole village were saved for rare occasions, a difficult childbirth, or a crude surgery the victim would never forget. In that uncomfortable life, finding a soft escape through plants was almost instinctive. No one called it getting high. It was just a cup of herbal tea to sleep better, a handful of odd seeds tossed into a pot of wine to dull a toothache, or a root soaked in alcohol that a monk said would bring you a pure dream. It sounds romantic, but it came from a need to survive. A pounding headache could keep a farmer from ploughing. A string of sleepless nights could cause a craftsman to ruin a week's work. And in a time without aspirin or tranquilizers, a leaf might be the line between making it through the day and collapsing. So the medieval nervous system learned to cling to whatever it could. A mushroom from the woods, a pinch of seeds from the garden, or a passed-down oil rubbed into the skin. Taken in the right dose, it soothed. Taken too far, it might convince you that you'd spoken with the dead, or worse, that you were one of them. Today, when we talk about altered consciousness, we think of neuroscience, chemistry, or lab experiments. But in the Middle Ages, consciousness was just that blurry edge between waking and dreaming, between aching and easing, between the sound of church bells and the wind hissing through the cracks in the door. So when a herb made the mind feel lighter, they didn't see it as sin. They might call it a blessing from God, or the magic of Mother Earth. What mattered was that for a little while, it helped them forget. Just for the evening, picture it, a whole village wrapped in night, lit only by flickering torches. Everyone asleep on dry straw. And in one corner, an old woman pulls out a pot of herbal brew, whispering a few words of prayer. Nothing dramatic. But in that moment, an entire community leans quietly on a single stem, just to find a little peace of mind. Today, if you accidentally drink a coffee that's too strong and your heart races, you might blame the barista. In the Middle Ages, if you accidentally chewed a few henbane seeds and started running around the village barefoot, screaming that you were a reincarnated duck, the village would think you were possessed. And that's when the healer, with his 2 painkillers, would have to decide, should he give you more wine or call the priest for an exorcism? The medieval world had no coffee, no clocks, and certainly no peace of mind. In that gap, people turned to plants, roots, mushrooms, and strange mixtures, not just to numb the pain, but to disconnect from a life that never let up. We might call it getting high, but for them it was simply part of staying alive, a brief moment where the tired nervous system could rest, before the new day returned with mud, with taxes, and the toll of church bells. In the small gardens of medieval Europe, tucked between rows of kale, coriander, and a few sprigs of onion, you might come across a plant that even the toughest farmers regarded with a cautious eye. Its stalk blends into the weeds, its dark green leaves slightly thick. But when it blooms, something shifts. Pale yellow petals like old paper, etched inside with deep purple veins like congealed blood vessels. This is henbane. In Latin, Hyoscyamus niger, meaning the seed of the pig. No one quite knows how it got that name, but one thing is certain. To touch it is to touch the thin line between healing and self-destruction. To medieval people, henbane was no joke. They knew that the wrong dose could make you delirious, ramble nonsense, see things that weren't there, and sometimes never wake again. But the right dose? It was one of the very few weapons they had against pain. If you were a farmer with a rotten molar swelling half your face, and the village had only 2 doses of painkiller, as we've seen before, henbane could be salvation. A few crushed seeds mixed with wine might dull the pain like a soft veil of smoke settling over your brain. You'd drift off. And in that sleep, if only for a while, you'd no longer feel the tooth gnawing at your nerves. The cost, of course, was never simple. It was said that drinking henbane was like sleeping, but the sleep talks. You'd fall into dreams, but they would bleed into waking life. You might hear the wind, the pigs in the yard, the distant church bells, all joining in a strange dialogue in your mind, where every sound seemed sacred. One old woman once recalled how, under henbane's spell, She heard her dog preaching in the village priest's voice and even nodded in agreement. When she woke, she couldn't tell what had been real and what hadn't. But her back pain had eased. To prepare henbane safely was an art. There were no standardized manuals, only whispered recipes. Some healers simmered the leaves in milk to make ointments for aching joints or throbbing wounds. Others ground the seeds, mixing them into oil or wine to make drinkable remedies. But everyone knew dosage was the greatest danger. One seed might soothe, 10 might send you into a fevered trance, a handful could carry you to the other side. That's why henbane became the double-edged knife of medieval medicine, cure or curse, depending on the hands that touched it. If you stepped into a monastery back then, you might find a monk bent over thick herbals, carefully noting the properties of henbane. He'd write down how to brew it, signs of overdose, and warnings that even its scent could cause faintness if inhaled too long. Some manuscripts even advised planting it near pigsties, because pigs can handle the fumes better than humans. It sounds absurd but came from real observations. Pigs could nibble a few leaves and survive, while people rarely did. Modern medicine explains that henbane contains potent alkaloids, hyoscyamine, scopolamine, and atropine. These act directly on the nervous system, blocking the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, leading to dry mouth, blurred vision, racing heartbeats, and disoriented minds. Even a small dose can calm and dull pain. A higher one disconnects the brain from reality. It's the scopolamine that causes the strange hallucinations, half-dream, half-waking visions, with voices echoing out of the dark. And because of this same mechanism, some doctors today still use scopolamine derivatives to prevent nausea in motion sickness, or as pre-anesthetic sedatives before surgery. It's strange to think that a 12th century peasant woman and a 21st century physician might both place their trust in the same molecule. Only one called it magic, the other chemistry. In rural villages, henbane was also wrapped in supernatural whispers. People believed the cunning folk, local herbalists or so-called witches, used it in their flying ointments. Rubbed on the skin, it was said to lift you into the air, flying over rooftops, riding brooms across fields, speaking with spirit. Today we understand that it was merely the intense disorientation caused by scopolamine and atropine, combined with the weakness of the body. But back then, these experiences were remembered as proof that another world existed. Picture this. A poor farmer, his back pain so bad he can no longer till his field, goes to the village healer. She gives him a dose of henbane, stirred into honeyed wine. He drinks, feels his mind float, and soon falls asleep on straw. In the dream, he's soaring above the fields, watching crops grow lush and tall. He hears his father, long dead, saying this year's harvest will be bountiful. When he wakes, the pain is softened, and inside there is hope. Was it medicine, or just illusion? To him it didn't matter. What mattered was that through henbane, a man on the edge found a reason to keep going. Of course, not all endings were so gentle. Many records speak of mass poisonings, when too much henbane accidentally made its way into the beer or wine at village festivals. Whole communities falling into delirium, seeing visions of saints, then collapsing with nausea and pounding hearts. Such events were called divine punishment. Today we know they were just alkaloid overdoses, but in the darkness of the medieval world, henbane always wore two faces, one as healer, one as a demon playing with human lives. What makes henbane unique is that it offers a sleep that speaks. It doesn't just put you to sleep, it turns your sleep into a stage, where normal sounds become voices, where familiar shapes twist into sacred symbols. You lie there, in your thatched home. But in your mind, you're in a great cathedral, hearing prophecy, speaking with your ancestors. And when you wake, the line between dream and waking is so thin, you can no longer be sure. In a world without painkillers, without soft beds, without modern doctors, henbane was one of the few doorways through which the medieval nervous system could find peace. It was dangerous. It was strange. But it was also proof of a timeless human longing to step away just for a moment from pain and fear into the quiet mystery of a dream. In the medieval garden, there was a root that people feared, desired, and whispered about in tales too strange to believe. Mandrake, Mandragora officinarum, was not just a medicinal plant. It was a living legend. It grew from the soil, but entered the human mind like a mythical being. Imagine someone digging up a mandrake. What they unearthed wasn't a carrot or a familiar onion. Mandrake roots twisted and split into two long limbs, sometimes resembling tiny legs. The swollen root body could look oddly human, like a miniature torso. People looked at it and thought, this isn't just a root, this is a creature. And so imagination began to spin it into myth. Medieval Europeans believed that pulling up a mandrake made it scream, not just the sound of roots tearing from damp soil, but the cry of a living soul ripped from the earth. And that scream, they said, was deadly, strong enough to kill whoever heard it. So who would dare to dig one up? That's where strange rituals emerged. Herbals and folktales offered a safe method. First, dig around the root, but never touch it directly. Then tie a cord around its base, fastening the other end to a strong male dog. Stand back, cover your ears, release the dog bolts. The mandrake comes free, it screams, the dog collapses, dead from the sound. The owner, safe and distant, ears covered, survives. And the mandrake is now theirs. It's a grim tale, yet tinged with dry absurdity. People were willing to sacrifice a dog to possess a root they believed held supernatural power. Some texts even instructed, bury the dog respectfully afterward, it had died for its master. Then the mandrake would be cleaned, wrapped in cloth, and kept as a talisman. Mandrake was more than a remedy. It was a symbol. Shaped like the human form, it was believed to contain powers of fertility, sexuality, and life itself. A childless man might keep one in the house, hoping his wife would conceive. A woman might use it as a love charm, hoping to draw someone's eye. A witch might grind it into ointment to summon dreams of flight and magic. And Europe was not alone in this belief. In ancient China, ginseng was revered for its root that resembled a tiny person. The more human it looked, the more potent it was thought to be, pulsing with life energy. In Japan, stories told of hitogata, human-shaped dolls made from paper or wood, used to absorb one's sins and cast them into rivers for cleansing. In parts of Africa, roots were carved into human forms, believed to house the spirits of ancestors. Mandrake, then, was part of a larger pattern. When people see their own shape reflected in nature, they give it power. A root could become a charm, a cure, or a curse, simply because it looked more like us than the others. Mandrake crept into art and literature too. In many medieval manuscripts, it's illustrated as a tiny person, sometimes naked, with clear limbs. The artists didn't care for botanical accuracy. What mattered was the symbol. This root was a person, and thus a bridge between humanity and the earth. Shakespeare, in Romeo and Juliet, even speaks of the mandrake's scream, a haunting sound rising from the ground. If you ask what it feels like to use mandrake, the answer is a mixture of dream and nightmare. Like henbane, mandrake contains powerful alkaloids, hyoscyamin, and scopolamine. They dry the mouth, blur the eyes, quicken the heart. But mandrake also pulls the mind deep into hallucinations, waking dreams where one might see ancestors, deities, or even visions of themselves being torn apart. It's no wonder people imagined the root screaming. It wasn't the root, but the brain, unraveling in chemical chaos. A healer might use a small dose to sedate a patient before removing a tumor or a rotten tooth, a crude form of pre-anesthesia, sometimes effective. But just a little too much, and the patient might sleep forever. In a world without heart monitors or trained anesthetists, everything was a gamble. And it's that razor-thin edge that made mandrake so alluring. It wasn't just a plant, it was a philosophical question. Why does this root resemble a human? Why does it carry both life and death? And why across every culture do we long to see ourselves reflected in the wild, in a ginseng root, a wooden doll, or a screaming mandrake? If you passed through a medieval garden at night, you might see a mandrake root hanging on a cottage wall like a talisman. People believed it could ward off demons, protect wealth, guard the home, but just as many whispered warnings, be careful. Mandrake could turn on you, bring ruin if disrespected. One root, one belief, and countless stories woven around it. Today we know there is no scream when mandrake is pulled, just a dry root snapping free from moist soil. But the scream lives on, not in the air, but in the imagination that's echoed for centuries. It's the sound of fear, of wonder, of the need to give meaning to what we don't understand. And sometimes that scream becomes a lullaby, helping a medieval soul forget their pain and find a flicker of magic in a weary life. In the medieval herb garden, among humble bushes of mint and rosemary, there was a flower so beautiful and so dangerous that people gave it a name both seductive and unsettling: belladonna, Italian for beautiful woman. The name sounds like a compliment, but it's also a veiled warning, because the very thing that creates beauty in this plant can also kill. Belladonna grows tall, with glossy green leaves and bell-shaped, deep purple flowers, looking almost harmless, but hidden inside every petal, every glossy berry black as a cat's eye, is a potent cocktail of alkaloids, atropine and scopolamine, compounds that can scramble the heartbeat, widen the pupils, and send consciousness drifting far from the shores of reality. Even in Roman times, belladonna was known. It's said that female assassins from Italy's Borgia family used its extract to lace wine or food, quietly removing enemies. One drop could confuse, two would sedate, and a few more might stop the heart altogether. Strangest of all, though, the same plant that could be a silent poison was once used as a secret of beauty. In Renaissance Italy, beauty ideals favored large, dark, shimmering eyes, eyes that always seemed open wide to the world. Women in court, especially in Florence and Venice, would place drops of belladonna extract into their eyes to dilate the pupils. It made their gaze appear darker, deeper, more alluring. A single glance could leave a man trembling. But the price was bitter irony, blurred vision, dizziness, fading sight, and sometimes blindness. They became more beautiful, more captivating, but lost their ability to see the world clearly. It was called the price of beauty. And in this case, it wasn't just a metaphor. Some accounts say that queens and noblewomen treated belladonna as a soft weapon in court. A shimmering glance, made brilliant by poison, could be an invitation or a warning. Men were drawn in, unaware that the more beautiful the eyes, the closer they were to danger. Court legends from the Borgia and Medici circles added layers of mystery. Some claimed a powerful lady silenced an entire room with nothing but her dilated eyes. Others told of a royal banquet that ended in chaos after guests drank wine laced with belladonna. Beyond beauty, belladonna had a place in medicine. Healers used minute doses to dilate pupils during eye examinations, a technique still used in modern ophthalmology. It was also prescribed to ease muscle spasms, calm stomach pain, and at times as a mild sedative. But the line between remedy and poison was razor thin. Even the most skilled physicians handled it with trembling hands. A single miscalculation could turn a prescription into a death sentence. In ritual and folk belief, belladonna was tied to the supernatural. Some wise women and so-called witches were accused of using it to make flying ointments. Rubbed onto the skin to create the sensation of leaving the body, soaring above rooftops and speaking with spirits. In truth, these were just the effects of scopolamine, disorientation, sedation, hallucination. But to a medieval mind, the experience was irrefutable proof of magic, and belladonna doesn't stand alone in the world's cultural history. In India, datura, a plant with similar alkaloids, was used in rituals of Shiva, bringing trance or death. In South America, tribes turned to coca and ayahuasca to expand consciousness and touch the divine. And in Europe, belladonna had its role as both doorway to vision and test of mortality. Picture an Italian court banquet, flickering candlelight, red wine, soft music, drifting. Among the guests, some arrive with pupils widened by belladonna. They gaze at each other with dark, gleaming eyes, each word laced with intention. Perhaps a noblewoman sits quietly, glass in hand, smiling at a political rival. Her beauty, dizzying, but inside the wine, the same extract that made her eyes so bright. In a time where power, beauty, and poison were threads of the same cloth, belladonna became the perfect symbol. Deadly beauty, seductive, and terrifying. Today, when a doctor drops atropine into your eye to inspect the retina, you're reliving a piece of that history, only now the dose is measured and no one calls it witchcraft. But looking back through medieval eyes, belladonna still holds its mystery. One drop for beauty, one drop for pain, and one drop for goodbye. The name beautiful woman holds two faces. It praises allure, while warning of its price. Eyes open wide while the mind drifts. A woman made irresistible, and at the same time a hostage of the plant itself. And in the shadows of Italy's palace halls, those dilated eyes may have been both weapon and verdict. In the faded pages of medieval European notebooks, nestled between recipes for cough remedies and herbal cures, there are occasional mentions of something that sounds like a fairy tale, flying ointment. It was said that on moonlit nights, wise women and witches would apply a thick salve, brewed from roots, poisonous leaves, and animal fat, onto their skin. And then their bodies would lift from the earth, gliding over fields, across rooftops, to commune with demons or attend midnight festivals of shadow. The ingredients nearly always came from the same family: henbane, belladonna, mandrake, the plants we've already met. They were crushed, steeped in pig fat or oil, sometimes mixed with ash or resin. It was believed that when applied to the skin, especially in places where the flesh was thin and full of blood vessels, the ointment would enter the bloodstream and send the mind on a journey unlike anything in waking life. Picture a woman in a thatched hut in the forests of Bavaria. Inside, the light is low. A small oil lamp flickers. At her table, she stirs a small pot, its contents thick, sharp-scented, clinging to the air. She rubs it onto her hands, her chest, maybe even more sensitive places. She never leaves the room, but in her mind her body begins to lift. Light as breath, the walls fall away, the ground drops, and she floats, soaring past thatched roofs. Laughter, firelight, strange faces, all vivid, all real. What's uncanny is how similar these descriptions were across different stories. Many claimed to have flown to witch sabbaths, danced with spirits, spoken with demons. To the medieval world, this was proof. Magic was real. This woman wasn't just a village healer, she was a witch who could leave her body behind. The records of heresy trials are filled with such confessions. But from a modern perspective, there is another explanation. There was no flight, only hallucination. The alkaloids in belladonna and henbane, absorbed through the skin, induce a dreamlike state, rapid heartbeat, muscle heaviness, and, most notably, the illusion of movement. The brain, while the body is still, fabricates powerful sensations, much like dreaming that you're falling and jolting awake. At higher doses, those sensations become entire journeys, flying, floating, traveling through space. That's why people believed witches could fly, because their brains, deep in chemical confusion, told them they already had. What's fascinating is how universal this desire to fly becomes. In South America, indigenous peoples use ayahuasca, a brew of vine and leaf containing DMT, to expand awareness. Those who drink it often describe rising into the sky, meeting ancestors, speaking with spirit animals. In North America, some tribes use peyote, a small cactus, to induce colorful visions and spiritual voyages. In parts of Africa, the Yoruba people perform possession rites using plant medicines and rhythmic drums to enter trance, where the soul feels it has left the body and traveled elsewhere. Europe had flying ointment, the Americas had ayahuasca, Africa had spirit rites. All of them meet at the same point, a longing to leave the body, to go somewhere farther, to seek answers the waking world cannot provide. In a witch trial in the 15th century Germany, a woman, under torture, confessed she had flown to Brocken Mountain, the site of the devil's feast. But if we set aside torture and religious fear, we might imagine something else, a woman in a dark hut. She applies the salve, closes her eyes, and in her mind she crosses forests and peaks, feels cold air on her skin, hears the laughter of hundreds. Her brain, lost in chemical fog, constructs a perfect scene, and she believes it, fully. Which raises a quiet question: what if reality and illusion aren't as far apart as we think? To a medieval woman, a flight induced by ointment was no less real than walking through the fields in daylight. And perhaps, to her, the imagined journey was even more real because it gave her something the real world never could: a story, a reason to continue. Today, when we read about flying ointment, we know it was just a mixture of toxins, numbing the skin, speeding the heart, blurring the mind. But back then, it was a doorway, a way for those without power, without place, to find a universe of their own. And maybe it was those imagined flights that helped them endure the long labor, the cold winters, the weight of poverty. If you sit quietly now and imagine, you might see a medieval woman rubbing the ointment onto her skin, closing her eyes and smiling. Her body stays seated, still in the cramped room, but her mind has already flown over forests, over mountains, into a world she chose. And in that dream, no one could judge her. If Europe had belladonna and flying ointments, then across the Mediterranean, in the lush gardens of Persia and Egypt, there was something else that carried people beyond the ordinary: hashish. From the leaves and resin of the cannabis plant, people learned to grind, cook, and press it into small cakes, or blend it into sweets, creating another path to comfort. Sometimes it brought joy, sometimes a door into quiet reflection. The origins of hashish are still debated. Some scholars trace its popularity back to the 11th century, when wandering Sufis, spiritual travelers within the Islamic world, used it as a way to reach stillness. The hashish cakes were often made by simmering resin in oil or honey, then mixing in spices like cinnamon or nutmeg, shaping it into small portions. When eaten, the sweet and spiced flavor would spread through the body, and soon after, the mind would begin to float. Unlike wine, strictly forbidden in Islam, hashish held a strange position. It wasn't alcohol, it wasn't fermented, yet it invited forgetting. Many Sufi mystics defended it, saying it didn't break divine law, that it simply opened another path to dissolve the ego, to hear the whisper of God. To them, hashish wasn't a diversion, it was a vessel, a way to sit quietly at night, close the eyes and feel the self disappear like a shadow into the wind. In one Sufi poem it's written, "When the sweetness melts on the tongue, I forget the name I was given. When the smoke rises thin, I see the whole sky inside a grain of dust. When the heart opens, there is no more me and no more you." It's not the language of science, it's the language of someone trying to slip past the narrow frame of identity. And hashish, if only for a moment, became a companion on that journey. Picture a Cairo evening in the 13th century. In a small tea house tucked into an alley, the golden light of oil lamps flickers against glass cups. A group of men sit on woven rugs, passing around a long pipe. Sweet smoke rises, curling around half-sung, half-spoken conversations. The sound of an oud drifts faintly from a distant corner. And within the haze, their eyes slowly close, their minds letting go, no longer burdened by trade, by law, or by fear of tomorrow. What's striking is that hashish wasn't only tied to peace. It was also linked to indulgence. In some large cities, it was seen as a pastime of the common folk, a quiet rebellion, in contrast to the hidden wine of the wealthy. Authorities tried repeatedly to ban it, raiding hashish houses, breaking pipes, but they sprang back like weeds after rain. Between the law and real life, people always found a crack in the wall to shelter their habits. From a medical view, we now know hashish contains cannabinoid compounds, especially THC, which act directly on the central nervous system. They alter how the brain processes memory, sensation, and time. Users may feel time stretch out, music grow deeper, colors turn brighter. To a Sufi, it was seeing the universe in a grain of dust. To a weary farmer, it was simply a chance to rest after a long day in the fields. Hashish also found its way into literature. In Arabic folk tales, many stories feature those who drifted into dream after eating it. A poor young man swallows a bit of hashish and imagines himself king, issuing commands to an imaginary court. When he wakes, he's still on his worn mat. But the dream was enough to make him laugh for the rest of the day. Such stories were both warnings: don't lose yourself in fantasy, and quiet acceptance. Even illusion has its place. In some Sufi lodges, hashish may have been part of the ritual, not always, but in certain groups it helped ease the body into meditation. When the dervish dance, the endless spinning, was paired with deep breathing and the effects of hashish, they said they felt themselves dissolve into the turning of the cosmos. Some mystics believed it was a way to touch the shadow of God, not through reason, but through direct experience. The medieval world saw hashish through two lenses. To some, it was a tool of insight, of poetry, of spirit. To others, it was an excuse for laziness, for sin, for defying the law. Just like belladonna in Europe, both medicine and poison, hashish floated between the sacred and the profane. Even now, hashish still exists, sometimes in shadows, sometimes beneath the legal light. But if we return to the 13th century, sit down in a hazy Egyptian tea house, we might understand why it held on so tightly. Because in a world of rules and worry, hashish offered one simple moment: to sit down, to breathe, and for a heartbeat, to let the small self fade, making space for a universe far greater. If hashish was the sweet that melted on the tongue and led the mind into dreaming, then in another direction, medieval people followed a much older path, one ancient enough to be named in the Bible, the path of rising smoke. Frankincense, the pale resin of Arabian trees, and myrrh, the deep red sap of Somalia and Ethiopia, had burned in incense burners for thousands of years. When touched by flame, they turned into thin, fragrant smoke, rising upward like the slow breath of the earth offered to the sky. In medieval Europe, inside churches, incense became a bridge between the mortal and the divine. People believed the smoke carried prayers upward, rising past the rafters and dissolving into the air, whispers too soft for human ears. But the smoke was not just a symbol. Anyone who has stood in a thickly perfumed church remembers it clearly. The weight in the chest, the slowing breath, the mind growing light, almost dreamlike. Modern science tells us that frankincense contains incensol acetate, a compound that acts on the brain to reduce anxiety and create a sense of calm. Myrrh, with its sharp, bitter scent, has a mild sedative effect as well. No wonder that long ceremonies thick with incense left worshippers feeling adrift, as if music, stained glass light and smoke had woven a scene no longer of this earth. If we look further south and east, incense is not only European. In ancient Egypt, incense was offered to the gods from the earliest times. Inside massive temples along the Nile, it was called the breath of the gods, a purifier of air, a gateway for the soul. The Egyptians used kaifi, a complex blend of resins, woods, wine, honey, and dozens of herbs, boiled and shaped into incense balls. When burned, kaifi released a sweet, deep aroma. It was both a sacred cleanser of space and, in some texts, a sleep aid, a scent to guide dreams into clarity. In India, incense is inseparable from Hindu worship. From small family pujas to grand temple rituals, the smoke of dhup and agarbatti is ever present. It is said to cleanse negative energies and invite the presence of gods. Many Indian incenses contain essential oils from sandalwood, jasmine, and licorice root, all known to calm the nervous system. When a monk sits cross-legged before an oil lamp, breathing in the scent, his pulse slows, his focus deepens, and the mind drops into stillness, almost trance. The remarkable thing is that, from Egypt to India, from Europe to the Middle East, incense always serves the same purpose, to open a different kind of space, right where you are. You don't need to leave your body, you don't need to drink or eat anything. You only need to breathe and let the smoke curl through your lungs. Suddenly the hard stone walls soften, the dark no longer threatens. It becomes a curtain pulled aside, revealing something unseen. In the medieval world, where illness, hunger, and violence were everyday realities, incense may have been one of the few acceptable paths to escape. Wine was restricted. Strong herbs could bring accusations of witchcraft. But incense? It belonged fully to God. It soothed the soul and sanctified that soothing in sacred light. Picture a morning mass in a Gothic cathedral. Soft light filters through blue and red glass, spilling onto cold stone. A priest lifts a brass censer, gently swinging it. Pale blue smoke unfurls in slow spirals, filling the nave. Chants echo gently, mingling with the distant sound of bells. You stand among the congregation and breathe. The resin's burnt sweetness stings your nose, makes your eyes blur just slightly. Your body feels lighter, as if the world around you has stepped back, leaving only the rhythm of smoke, sound, and a slowing heartbeat. This is a legal kind of intoxication, soft, sacred, and permitted, It's no surprise that incense once drove one of the largest trade networks of the ancient world. Camel caravans crossed deserts carrying frankincense from Yemen and Oman to the Mediterranean. Ships ferried myrrh from Africa to Egypt, then on to Greece and Rome. Incense wasn't just valuable, it was sacred cargo, spiritual nourishment traded like treasure. Today, incense can be bought at any market stall, lit to repel mosquitoes or perfume a room. But in the Middle Ages, each curl of smoke was a bridge, a way to step outside the weight of life and believe, if only for a moment, that the sky had opened and was listening. After the incense smoke of the temples and the sweet hashish of the Sufis, we return to a more familiar, less mystical drink. Yet in the Middle Ages, it was a matter of survival, beer and wine. Not because everyone wanted to be drunk, but because drinking water simply wasn't safe. Imagine living in a 13th century European town. The river flowing through town was the same place people washed clothes, let livestock bathe, dumped garbage, and sometimes even discarded animal carcasses. If you scooped water from it and drank, you had a high chance of getting sick, vomiting, or dying young. No wonder the average lifespan was so low. Instead of drinking water, people consumed liquids that had been boiled, fermented, and contained a small amount of alcohol, ale or wine. Ale, an early form of beer without hops, was usually brewed from barley or oats. Grains were cooked into a thick porridge, fermented with yeast, and left to develop naturally. The result was a cloudy, thick, slightly sour drink with low alcohol content, only around 2 to 4%. But the crucial thing was it was safer than water, since the boiling and fermentation killed off bacteria. Even children drank ale. Adults drank it all day, from morning to night, not to get drunk, but simply to stay alive. In colder regions like Northern Europe, ale recipes often used oats and sometimes added local herbs like dandelion or sweet gale. These gave it a bitter, herbal taste and helped preserve it longer. The Scandinavians added honey to beer to make mead, a sweet, potent beverage considered the drink of the gods in Norse mythology. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, where grapes grew easily, wine was the main drink. Unlike beer, wine could be stronger and stored better in ceramic jars. The Greeks and Romans had long practiced diluting wine with water for daily consumption, a habit that continued into the Middle Ages. In Italy, Spain, and France, wine was a mealtime staple. But wine back then wasn't the refined beverage we know today. It was often sharp, cloudy, and needed herbs or spices mixed in to make it more palatable. The difference between northern ale and southern wine reflects both climate and culture. In colder regions, barley thrived while grapes were rare. People drank heavy, calorie-rich ale almost like liquid bread. In the sunlit south, grapes flourished and wine became the blood of the land, tying together religion and everyday life. When a French monk lifted a chalice during Mass, he knew it symbolized the blood of Christ, but also that it was a familiar drink that sustained the whole community. Ale and wine were also closely tied to public safety. In many monasteries, brewing beer or fermenting wine became a vital task, not only for the monks, but for the local villagers. A 12th century Belgian monastery might produce hundreds of liters of beer a week. These barrels nourished the monks, fed the poor, and welcomed pilgrims. There's a saying, God made water, but man made beer, implying that water could kill, but beer could save. Another curious aspect was the everyday level of drunkenness. Since ale was low in alcohol, you had to drink a lot to get tipsy. And some people did. Harvest festivals often ended with the whole village staggering around, laughing and collapsing on the grass. But on regular days, drinking ale was more like how we drink tea or coffee, a background hum of daily life. Today, we often see beer and wine as indulgences or health risks. But in the Middle Ages, they were a kind of survival insurance. A mug of cloudy ale, though crude, was safer than a cool scoop of river water teeming with deadly microbes. Behind the mild buzz was actually a primitive public health system on which entire communities relied. Picture this: a winter morning in an English village. You wake up in a freezing timber house, the fire long gone out. You step outside into the mist and your wife is pouring a brownish liquid from a clay jug freshly brewed ale. You take a sip. It's slightly sour, a little bitter, and your stomach warms. No coffee, no tea, just this liquid bread to start your day. And then, if you travel south crossing the Alps into Italy, you'll see locals sipping watered-down wine with dry bread and olives. Same purpose, safe hydration, but different flavors, different rituals. From Northern Europe to the Mediterranean, ale and wine formed two poles of a thirsty world where safety didn't come from the village well, but from fermentation and herbs. In that world, being drunk wasn't just fun, it was sometimes the only way not to fall ill. And in the laughter of festival goers, in the prayers echoing through churches, we can still sense a common current: liquid, fermentation, and survival. If beer and wine were the liquids that kept medieval people alive, then grain bread was the solid food that sustained the entire world. But sometimes that very loaf of bread became the gateway to another kind of nightmare: ergot. Ergot is a parasitic fungus that grows on rye and occasionally on wheat. Visibly, it turns the grain kernels into long, dark, purple-black growths that resemble tiny horns. Poor farmers couldn't always tell the difference. In times of famine, when granaries were empty, every grain had to be ground into flour and baked into bread. And so, every loaf of dark, crusty bread brought to the table might carry the ergot toxin. Those who consumed it would soon feel a tingling, needle-like pain in their limbs. Then came convulsions and hallucinations. People called it St. Anthony's fire, named for the burning sensation in their bloodstreams, as if the body were catching fire from the inside. Fingers and toes turned purple, then gangrenous, and sometimes fell off. Meanwhile, the victim's mind wandered in a strange fever dream, visions of radiant light, disembodied voices, the sensation of flying. In a 10th century French village, records showed dozens of people seizing at once, eyes rolled back, mouths screaming, collapsing to the ground. They danced uncontrollably, their limbs thrashing as if possessed by some invisible force. The village called it a dancing plague. In some places, entire towns were swept up. Hundreds gathered in the square, dancing, swaying, collapsing from exhaustion, unable to stop. Priests blamed the devil, physicians were helpless, but perhaps in that morning's loaf of bread, a tiny fungus had taken root. Today, science tells us ergot contains alkaloids, especially ergotamine, which powerfully affects the nervous system. It constricts blood vessels, causes hallucinations, and was the chemical basis for Albert Hofmann's synthesis of LSD in the 20th century. Ironically, a fungus that once plagued medieval peasants became the key to unlocking a modern era of psychedelic research. But ergot is not just a European story. Some scholars have proposed that episodes of mass hysteria in other parts of the world may also be linked to ergot or similar fungi. In 17th century America, during the Salem witch trials, many women were accused of witchcraft, possibly triggered by symptoms of ergot poisoning. Young girls who had eaten contaminated rye exhibited seizures, screaming fits, and visions. In the Puritan community, steeped in belief in demons, this was quickly seen as witchcraft. Even in the Andes of South America, highland tribes knew that certain fungi growing on grain could induce intoxication and visions. They didn't view this as a disease, but rather incorporated it into ritual, though always with a hint of fear. Back in medieval Europe, Ergot embodied a cruel irony. It targeted the poorest, those who had no choice but to eat cheap rye bread. The rich ate white bread, made from cleaner wheat, less prone to fungal infection. So while the banquet halls glowed with feasting, the poor outside trembled with spasms, their limbs burning, crying out for St. Anthony's mercy. Monasteries dedicated to St. Anthony became refuges for the afflicted. Monks offered food, prayer, and sometimes amputated the gangrenous limbs. The sick lay on wooden beds, limbs wrapped in cloth, eyes fixed on the ceiling, minds still trapped in otherworldly hallucinations. Some said they saw fields of golden light or heard the music of angels. Others saw demons chasing them through the night. Imagine you're a young peasant. Yesterday, you ate bread with your family. Today, your fingers tingle like needles. You try to head to the fields, but your legs shake uncontrollably. The village gathers in the square, and one by one, people begin to dance. No music, no drums, just screams and stamping feet. You're pulled into the frenzy, your heart racing, sweat pouring, but you can't stop. Night falls, fires burn, and still they dance until collapse. Today we know it was fungal poisoning, but to the medieval mind, it was a divine or demonic sign. And perhaps that's why ergot became part of the collective imagination, a bridge between the visible and invisible world, between the daily meal and a terrifying dream. Bread meant to symbolize life could become a test of death. And in that mad dance we see a haunting truth. Even the most ordinary things in medieval life could become a door into another reality, one where your body no longer belongs to you, where hunger and death walk hand in hand, and a piece of black rye bread becomes your ticket to a dark and delirious feast. If ergot in bread was the earth's dark joke, then mad honey was nature's sweet little tease, delivered quietly by bees. Not all bees know this trick, but in Anatolia, a mountainous land sloping down to the Black Sea, wild bees have crafted a kind of honey that, if you eat enough, will send you collapsing to the floor, drenched in sweat, your heart slowing, your mind echoing with visions that do not belong to this world. Locals call it Delhi Balmad honey. The name wasn't coined by any Western scholar, but has long existed in their own folk tongue. It says simply what everyone knows: this honey makes you lose your mind for a while and leaves you somewhere between laughter and fear at nature's unknowable power. Why does Anatolia produce mad honey? The answer lies in the flowers the bees choose. Across the damp slopes above the Black Sea, rhododendrons grow thick. Not all are dangerous, but some species contain grayanotoxins, natural compounds harmless to bees, but enough to disturb a human's nervous system. The bees collect nectar, carry it back, and unknowingly stir the toxin into their golden brew. To the eye, this honey is thick, dark red, and carries a scent that's just a little off. Those who know honey in Anatolia only need one glance to recognize this is no ordinary honey. This is the kind that might lift you into flight and then leave you too weak to stand. Locals have long treated Delibal as a medicine. A small spoonful, melting slowly on the tongue, is said to lower blood pressure, ease stomach pain, help you sleep deeper. Some even believe it's an aphrodisiac used by men on their wedding night. But dosage is everything. 1 spoon helps, 2 is risky, 3, and by morning you may remember nothing but the outlines of a nightmare. Elders in Anatolia say that in wintertime, when entire villages gather in wooden homes against the cold, a little mad honey stirred into warm milk can ease the body into rest. They don't call it a hallucinogen, they call it mountain medicine. And truly, in a life shaped by hardship, even a strange dream can soften the soul. What's strangest of all is this: mad honey once became a weapon in war. In 67 BCE, when Roman troops under Pompey pushed deep into Pontus, the soldiers of King Mithridates VI laid a rare kind of trap. Instead of swords or ambush, they left jars of red honey along the road. The Roman soldiers, thinking they'd found spoils, ate their fill. Soon, they were vomiting, staggering, dropping to the ground. Some wandered aimlessly, as if drunk, but in truth, they were poisoned. At that moment, the Pontic army struck, cutting down hundreds of Roman soldiers, a rare victory against the world's most fearsome military machine. It's hard to believe bees and rhododendrons could defeat Rome. But history records it, a quiet reminder that sometimes nature is the fiercest ally of all. And it wasn't just Roman legions who met the sting. Medieval and early modern travelers also fell to the honey's trick. A Persian merchant once wrote that while passing through the Black Sea region, he was offered a spoonful of red honey. Moments later, he saw the sun fall and shatter into golden fragments. A 16th century Italian traveler wrote that he was walking upon the sea, each wave a glowing mirror. To modern readers, these tales may seem comical, but to those who lived them, the experience was both sacred and terrifying. For a few hours, the world cracked open into the pieces of a dream. And when they woke, their bodies were spent, their hearts slowed, their minds left hazy. Today we know that grayanotoxin in mad honey disrupts sodium ion channels in nerve cells. It scrambles the brain's electrical signals, causing dizziness, hallucination, and dangerously low blood pressure. In small doses, it can heal. In larger ones, it can kill. And here's the twist. The bees are never harmed. They keep gathering nectar, building hives, leaving behind a honey that's both remedy and trap. In a sense, bees don't just make honey, they craft one of nature's darkest jokes. Picture this. You live in a small village along the Black Sea. Outside, the wind slips through the shutters, heavy with salt and damp air. On a low wooden table, a jar of dark red honey sits thick as tree sap. You dip in a wooden spoon and bring it to your lips. Sweetness, tinged with bitterness, slides down your throat. At first, only a soft warmth, but minutes later, the oil lamp on the wall flickers into dozens of flames. The sound of the sea is no longer steady, it breaks into song. You close your eyes, and your body feels as if it's floating from the floor. In that moment, you're frightened, but also, you don't want to come back. When you finally open your eyes, you're still in the little house. Your shirt clings with sweat, your heart beats slow, your hands tremble, and you understand you've just tasted the joke of the bees, and next time, maybe half a spoon will do. Mad honey is not only Anatolia's story, it's a reminder that throughout history, what we eat and drink doesn't only keep us alive, it sometimes opens strange new doors. A single drop of honey can be medicine or poison. A hive of bees can, by accident, rewrite the history of an empire. Above all, mad honey shows us that nature keeps a kind of quiet, peculiar humor. It doesn't shout, it doesn't boast, it just leaves a jar of red honey in the corner of the kitchen and waits to see who's curious enough to try. In the medieval world, where even a few miles of travel could mean getting lost in the forest or stuck in mud, the most reliable thing was not a distant king, nor the priests in cold stone churches. It was something much closer, nameless individuals the community called by many names: healer, midwife, herb doctor, or simply cunning folk. They wore no golden robes, spoke no Latin prayers, but when a child burned with fever, when a man broke his leg in the fields, or when a mother struggled to give birth, it was they who were summoned. Medieval medicine bore no resemblance to today's bright hospitals filled with nurses, doctors, and machines. Back then, one could live an entire life and meet only one trained physician, and only if one lived near a city. In scattered villages, people had just one option: folk wisdom. These healers carried cloth bags filled with seeds, dried leaves, a few bottles of herbal oil, and a handful of words half prayer, half incantation. To villagers, they were a bridge between the natural world and the fragile thread of human life. Their knowledge came not from books but from oral memory passed down through generations. A lullaby might contain a cough remedy made from thyme. A winter bedtime story could hide a method for diluting mad honey just enough to not kill the drinker. A clumsy proverb might point to the best time for harvesting mandrake root. Communal memory was a living book, and each cunning folk held only a fragment of its pages. They were trusted because they were there in every part of life. They delivered babies in the dark when snow blanketed the roof. They treated the woodsman's axe wound. They whispered strange words to soothe the soldier haunted by war. They weren't separate from the community. They lived, ate, worked alongside everyone. Sometimes they were suspected, accused of dealings with devils. But when disaster struck, no one could deny that these were the ones people turned to. In such villages, knowledge wasn't written on parchment, but woven into songs. Children learned about mugwort the same way they learned the alphabet, by singing. Old women by the hearth told tales of a man who ate ergot bread and danced through the night until he collapsed, part cautionary tale, part grim comedy. Folk ballads celebrated bold midwives who both delivered babies and banished spirits using wreaths of rhododendron. These melodies slipped into ears, becoming memory's most reliable tool. If someone asked, "How do you know henbane helps with sleep?" the answer wouldn't be found in a medical treatise, but "My mother sang it to me," and her mother had heard it from her own. It was a long thread, an unbroken line stretching further back than any one person's memory. These tunes seemed never to vanish, for even when no one needed them to heal, they still lived on in song and story. Cunning folk also stood between two worlds, the natural and the supernatural. When illness defied explanation, they burned herbs, chanted, drew strange symbols on doors. This wasn't just medicine, it was comfort. In a world where dying young was common, and even small wounds could bring fever and death, people needed to believe someone or something was in control, and cunning folk gave them that belief. On long winter nights, when snow froze on rooftops and families huddled indoors, the stories of cunning folk made the darkness gentler. They spoke of bees who made mad honey with a wink, as if the bees were playing tricks. They told of mandrake that screamed when pulled from the earth, turning it into a bedtime joke for giggling children. They mentioned belladonna, the plant that made eyes shine bright, and laughed that it made heads shine too, in its own dizzy way. Every tale was a medicine for the soul, even if it didn't cure the body. In many communities, women played the most vital role. The midwife was birthbringer, healer, and storyteller, all in one. They passed down knowledge through lullabies, through rhymes whispered while rocking a baby. A child raised on such songs would never forget, "Don't pick mugwort in the rain, wait for sun at dawn." A simple verse, but really a blend of agricultural timing and medical advice. Of course, cunning folk weren't always respected. In years of crop failure, plague, or unanswered prayers, suspicion would turn against them. Some were accused of witchcraft, some brought to trial, but strangely, even then, their skills remained indispensable. Eventually, people came back quietly in the night to ask for a remedy, a blessing. It seemed a community could not live without them, no matter how loudly they denied it. Today, historians see cunning folk as part of a local knowledge network. This wasn't personal expertise, but a communal resonance preserved in memory, song, and anecdote. It was like an invisible library where each person held a page, and only together could they form a full book. When we read old ballads, find a healing recipe in a monastic notebook, or hear a faint lullaby echo through time, we catch glimpses of them, these nameless ones who kept villages alive. Not with power nor academic knowledge, but through patience, nearness, and the quiet trust they carried. Had you lived then, perhaps on a winter evening, you'd hear an old woman knitting quietly, humming a tune about brewing tea from peppermint leaves. Outside, wind rushes through the shutters, snow fills the yard. But inside that small room, the song is both lullaby and recipe, both comfort and survival. And when you grew up, you'd sing it to your child, not just passing on the melody, but also the legacy of life itself. Cunning folk and their web of local wisdom endured for centuries, rarely written down, rarely named in history books. Yet they were the quiet pillars holding fragile medieval life together. In whispered songs, fireside stories, and trembling hands offering a tiny vial, we find an unwritten legacy, a legacy of endurance and trust. If you imagine a medieval apothecary's workshop as a well-lit room lined with tidy wooden shelves and gleaming glass jars, it's probably best to erase that image from your mind. In reality, the workshop of a healer or midwife was often just a corner of the kitchen where soot-blackened walls bore the mark of countless fires, and the only light flickered from the oven flame. A low wooden table, a few stone mortars, a dented copper pot worn thin from years of use, this was all they had. And from this modest hearth, the smallest laboratories of the Middle Ages were born. Beside their homes, most cunning folk kept a garden. Not grand like the monastery plots, but a small patch of land just a few meters wide, where edible greens grew side by side with something more curious. Between rows of cabbages, a clump of mugwort might stand. Near the carrots and turnips, low henbane bushes with dark green leaves and purple speckled flowers. At the fence's edge, a rhododendron grew quietly, its nectar anything but innocent to those who lived there. Each plant had its own season for harvesting. On summer mornings, when dew still clung to the leaves, the midwife would step out to cut mugwort, binding it into small bundles to hang upside down in the kitchen rafters. Mandrake roots were dug in the fall when the earth was damp but not yet frozen. It was said that harvesting under the right moon drew out more of the plant's power, and that if you heard it scream, you should let a dog do the pulling. These weren't just superstitions, they were ways to mask a deeper truth, that some plants were dangerous and harvesting them could be deadly. In the kitchen, the mortar was indispensable. Dried leaves went in, pounded into paste, and mixed with a base of animal fat. Sometimes it was pork lard, sometimes churned butter, depending on the season. These mixtures could become poultices for wounds, or with a dash of belladonna, a flying ointment that sent the mind into strange and distant places. The small clay jars lining the corner shelf were just as vital. Unlabeled, differing only by a crack or shade of glaze, they held a world of brews, honey steeped with herbs, strong spirits infused with weeds, oils pressed from seeds. To the outsider, they looked all the same, but to the maker, each jar was known by heart, one for soothing a child's cough, one to lull a guard into sleep, one never to be touched except in a single, tiny drop. Some recipes were never spoken aloud, only passed down in families. A mother might whisper to her daughter while cooking, "Add 2 mugwort leaves to the soup, but no more, or it will slow the heart." Another midwife, rocking a grandchild, might sing, "Green leaves for sleep, purple flowers for dreaming, but the black root only for your enemies." A lullaby, yes, but also a warning. A few formulas grew into legend. There was a tea made from thyme, honey, and a pinch of henbane said to cure insomnia. 1 sip, and sleep would come deep. 2, and the dream might never end. There was a wedding wine rumored to make wedding nights unforgettable, not just from grapes, but from powdered belladonna. And then there was a special bread baked for spring festivals, the flour laced with ergot seeds, so potent the whole village would dance through the night, needing no music at all. To the church and its clergy, these were dangerous games, signs of witchcraft. But to the village, they were survival. When official medicine was scarce and costly, a salve that soothed pain, however risky, was better than nothing. No one spoke of hallucinations or psychology. They simply spoke of getting through the winter or saving someone from a burning fever. Perhaps the most curious part is this. The same recipe, depending on the dose, could heal or kill. A little belladonna brightened the eyes too much, and the mind went dark. A spoonful of mad honey eased a stomachache, a cupful, and an army collapsed. A handful of mugwort soothed restless sleep an armful, and the sleeper might never wake again. Cunning folk lived in that grey space between medicine and magic, knowing just how thin that line could be. Their workspaces always carried a dual nature. The room felt like any kitchen, filled with the scent of soup and baked bread, yet also like something otherworldly, lined with jars, dried herbs, and whispers. A visitor might not tell which was seasoning, which was medicine, and which was a substance to send the mind aloft. And that was why authorities grew uneasy. A harmless kitchen could conceal knowledge more dangerous than any banned book. But in small villages, no one worried about strict categories. Medicine, sedative, hallucinogen, they were all part of life. A single concoction might be used for a child, a patient, or a celebration. What mattered wasn't the nature of the plant, but the intention of the maker and the trust of the community. Imagine a winter night, the wind howling outside the door, the family gathered close around the hearth. An old woman reaches into the corner and lifts a small jar, dripping a few drops into warm milk. They drink, feel the warmth rise, feel drowsy, and the strange dreams begin. No one calls it a hallucination, they simply call it a good night's sleep. And the secret of that jar, of the little garden outside, of the hushed lullabies in the dark, is preserved passed on a legacy that needs no ink or paper. Those workshops, those small gardens, and those hidden recipes were the crossing point between the ordinary and the extraordinary. From them, people learned how to survive, how to dream, and sometimes how to fly, if only in the mind. In the medieval world, a folk healer needed to know more than which leaf soothed fevers, which root stopped bleeding, or which flower brought sleep. They needed something else, something often far more important: the ability to make the patient believe they would heal. And to do that, they often had to wear the cloak of mystery, blending medicine with magic, pairing a bitter draught with a whispered prayer, turning the act of healing into a kind of ritual. If you were a 12th century farmer living in a village where darkness claimed more hours than light, where the wind through the forest could easily become a ghost in your mind, you wouldn't be swayed by dry explanations. Time contains compounds that open the airways would sound too strange. But time is a gift from St. George to drive evil from your chest. That would make sense. Each remedy wasn't just a biological solution. It was a myth retold in words the listener could grasp and believe. Cunning folk, midwives, and herbalists often took on the role of village sorcerer. When they handed you a jar of medicine, they didn't just say, "Drink this." They might whisper a charm, draw a cross over the cup, or drop a few grains of salt into the water to chase away spirits. In truth, the salt only changed the taste, but to the patient, it transformed the bitter liquid into something sacred, something with power beyond the physical. Many of them understood how to use sound and sight as well. A healer might hum softly while pounding herbs in a mortar, the rhythm of voice and pestle blending into a quiet trance. A string tied around the wrist could serve both as charm and reminder that the sickness was being held in check. And when the patient believed, their body often followed, that which we now call the placebo effect. These gestures weren't random, they reflected a truth. In many communities, the line between healer and mystic simply didn't exist. To treat illness, one had to be a storyteller, a ritualist, an emotional guide. And this wasn't just true in Europe, it echoed across the world. Look to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Shamans, often called medicine men, never simply administered herbs. They danced, they played flutes, they called out to the spirits. They burned tobacco or scented leaves to surround the patient in smoke, believing it carried illness away. When needed, they used drums to bring the sick into a trance, to make them feel as though they had crossed a threshold. And within that threshold, healing could take place. Compare this with a medieval midwife who might fill a birthing room with the smoke of burning mugwort, not just to ward off insects, but to calm the family, to signal that the space had been spiritually cleansed. A herbalist might dip a branch in water and flick it toward a patient, just as a shaman would sprinkle sacred leaves. Both created a stage for healing, where mind and body entered a new state together. What's remarkable is that even without measurable medicinal effects, these rituals brought comfort. A mother might feel calmer hearing a healer's song while her child burned with fever. A wounded soldier might believe in recovery when his bleeding was sealed with ashes and prayer. And that calm when pain relief was rare and suffering constant was itself a step toward survival. At times, this role as mystic left them vulnerable. When things went well, they were praised as miracle workers, but when a cure failed, suspicion crept in. Some were accused of witchcraft, of consorting with dark forces rather than divine ones. It was the danger of being a healer behind a mask trusted and revered, yet always on the edge of peril. Still, without that mask, they might not have endured at all. People needed more than medicine. They needed a story to believe in. And the healers understood that a remedy, like a prayer, gained its true power only when it was performed. Today we might call this primitive psychotherapy. But step into the medieval world and you'll see it was the only way healing could feel real. A potion might be nothing more than steeped herbs, but when handed to you under candlelight, with trembling fingers and a whispered blessing, it became something else entirely. In that moment, hope itself became part of the cure. From Europe to the Americas, from cottage kitchens to shamans' tents, the same pattern repeated. Medicine and magic were not rivals, but companions. The healer was not just a mixer of roots, but a performer, a musician, a storyteller, a bridge between the seen and the unseen. And perhaps it was this blend that helped communities survive through centuries of shadow before science could walk on its own. Imagine a winter night. You're burning with fever, shivering in your bed. The room is dark. Wind whistles through the cracks. An old woman sits beside you and hands you a cup of bitter tea made from dry leaves. Before you drink, she draws a cross over the rim, murmurs a prayer. You close your eyes and swallow, and suddenly, in your chest, there's a flicker of belief. Perhaps the medicine hasn't worked yet, but that belief quiets your shaking. That's the moment when medicine wears the mask of magic, and you, in your frailty, accept it as a kind of miracle. One thing rarely mentioned in the mysterious tales of the medieval world is just how often people went on journeys they never intended to take. Not everyone sought out henbane or mandrake in hopes of exploring dreamlike realms. In fact, the strangest experiences often came from a simple mug of ale meant to quench a farmer's thirst, or a loaf of bread shared by the family with their evening vegetable soup. In a world without microscopes or hygiene standards, any food could become a doorway to something uncanny. A loaf of rye bread left too long in a damp storeroom might grow ergot, a parasitic fungus. No one could see it inside the bread. They only knew that after the meal, their limbs trembled, their minds filled with bizarre visions, and their bodies started to dance against their will. A whole village could erupt into a sudden festival, but no one was truly celebrating. This was the dancing plague, a real phenomenon recorded many times throughout history. In beer, the problem was sometimes worse. In the cold northern regions, beer was brewed from barley and flavored with all kinds of herbs. Hops weren't yet common, so brewers used a mixture called groot wormwood, yarrow, henbane, juniper. One cup warmed you, sharpened your senses. A third cup clouded the mind, and you might see strange beings, a saint, a spirit, or sometimes a demon. The problem was no one went looking for them. How did communities respond to these accidents? At first, with fear. When a group saw visions, or an entire village collapsed in convulsions, no one blamed mold or alkaloids. They blamed the devil. They called for the priest, burned incense, performed exorcisms. Mass poisonings became proof that dark forces were among them. And from there, the stories of witches took root. In some cases, they found a convenient culprit. If an old woman had sold bad flour, she might be accused of aiding Satan. A healer who mismeasured henbane in a cough syrup could be branded a witch. Few wanted to believe it was a simple mistake. Randomness was too terrifying, evil made more sense. The church responded by reinforcing doctrine. Hallucinations were tests from Satan. Seeing demons meant your faith was too weak. Dancing to exhaustion meant possession. And so natural poisonings, from bread, beer, honey, became religious events. Civil law joined in. Local courts sometimes punished those deemed responsible for such disasters, even if they had only sold the food. One 14th century case recorded a baker in Germany being heavily fined after the entire town fell ill from his bread. No one tested for fungus. They only knew something strange had happened after his meal. Sometimes the confusion was even more bitter. A group of patrolling soldiers might find a wild beehive, eat its honey for energy only, to discover it was mad honey from rhododendron flowers. They collapsed, dreaming of monsters. When they woke, they claimed demons had struck them down. From then on, the entire forest was believed haunted. A few bees, a little honey enough to curse a whole landscape for generations. For villagers, these stories served another purpose: warning and control. A child sneaking moldy bread from the pantry might be told, "The devil will make you dance to death." An adult who drank too much herbal ale would be warned that evil spirits will pay a visit. These warnings, though based on misunderstanding, at least encouraged caution around food and drink. Through the lens of modern science, we now know that chemicals were to blame. Ergot produces natural LSD. Belladonna induces hallucinations. Henbane disrupts the heart. But in the medieval world, where science hadn't yet arrived, belief filled the void. That belief turned food poisoning into a story of demons. Imagine you're a 13th century farmer. You've worked the fields all day, stomach hollow with hunger. You eat a slice of dark bread, drink a cup of cheap ale. Soon, your vision swims, your thoughts drift. You see a circle of white-clad figures dancing around your bed. You scream. Neighbors rush in. The story that follows isn't "the bread was moldy," it's "a demon came to visit." And from nights like these, legends grew. Legends of fevered dancing, of men who saw devils in the dark, of witches who slipped spells into dough. These weren't just fantasy, they were born of a time when every food accident carried a moral lesson. It was the cost of living in a world where the line between real and supernatural was never quite clear. A world where each cup of ale, each crust of bread, didn't just sustain but might open a door to a strange and unwanted place. For many centuries of the medieval world, the line between prayer and medicine barely existed. To villagers, a medicinal herb was never just a plant, it was a sacred gift, a gift from God, from the saints, from Mother Nature. And so healing was rarely just a matter of taking medicine. It often unfolded in a space that was part clinic, part ritual. Imagine a small wooden house wrapped in winter mist, a child coughing through the night. The mother, worried, brings them to the village midwife. The midwife takes a handful of thyme and mint, crushes them in a stone mortar, mixes in honey. But before handing over the bowl, she places it on the wooden table, lights a candle, and softly recites a prayer. The child watches the candlelight dance across the walls, hears the even, low voice, and when the herbal honey touches their lips, they feel safer. Not only is the body tended to, but the spirit is gently wrapped in an invisible blanket. Many healing moments like this became communal rites. When someone in the village fell seriously ill, neighbors would gather, each bringing herbs from their own garden. The dark room would glow with candlelight. A simple chant would rise, sometimes just a few lines repeated over and over in a plea for mercy. In that space, the bowl of medicine was stirred like a miniature mass. The patient drank, and faith filled the room like steam from the herbs. To the church, this was a grey area. Some clergy accepted that herbs were gifts from God, and prayer merely amplified their power. Others saw it as a dangerous blending of faith and folk magic. If a midwife prayed more than she quoted scripture, suspicion could rise. But in practice, most villagers didn't worry. They needed both. Herbs to soothe the fever, and prayer to calm the fear. In some monasteries, the same combination was used. The monastery herb gardens were not just for study, they were an extension of religious life. When picking chamomile, monks might recite a verse. When brewing salves, they sometimes sang hymns. Medieval medical texts often listed formulas side by side with prayers, as if the two were never meant to be separate. There are records of nighttime ceremonies in 14th century Bavaria where entire villages gathered to drive out disease. Juniper was burned, smoke passed through homes carried by prayer. Afterwards, people drank a bitter herbal brew with wine, believing the combination of smoke, words, and taste would seal the doors against illness. To them, the smoke was a veil, the wine a shield, the song a chain to keep evil outside. Today we might explain it all through psychology. When a sick person sits in a room lit by candles, hears steady chanting, and drinks something with a strong taste, their brain enters a calmer state. Heart rate slows, fear softens, and the body responds more easily to the herbs. But to the medieval mind, it was proof that belief and medicine were two sides of the same mirror. In many places, healing songs were passed down like nursery rhymes. This leaf for peaceful sleep, that leaf to ward off spirits, and this song to keep the heart still. The tune might be childish, even silly, but the repetition worked like a kind of trance. The fevered patient would hear the same lines again and again, until slowly their body cooled. Now and then, a bit of dry humour slipped between the prayer and the poultice. A midwife might toss in a clove of garlic to scare the devil off. The patient would grimace at the taste, the room would chuckle, and tension would break. That laughter, strangely enough, was a kind of medicine too. In a world where sickness and death always lurked nearby, combining prayer and medicine was how people made sense of it all. If healing came, it was thanks to God and the herbs. If it didn't, then at least the sick were surrounded by care and faith. A failed cure was never a complete failure because it left behind a story and a community that had faced the darkness together. Looking back, it's clear this was an early form of what modern medicine now calls holistic care, not just treating the body, but also the mind and the soul. Medieval people didn't know serotonin or placebos, but they knew one truth. Medicine works best when it comes with hope, and hope, for them, was lit by candles, sung in chant, and swallowed in the bitter sip of a healing brew. Bandich tieng an qua juan van tren. In every medieval village, there was always someone who had to make decisions no one else wanted to bear. Not the lord, not the priest, but the healer, the midwife, the herbalist, or sometimes a monk with some knowledge of herbs. They held a strange kind of power, the power to choose between a dose that could save a life or, just as easily, end one. Ordinary people viewed them with both reverence and fear. After all, who would willingly drink a bowl of liquid brewed from a root that, if mismeasured, could become poison? Their work, at its core, was the art of balance. A sprig of henbane could ease unbearable pain, but just a few extra leaves could send the heart into fatal arrhythmia. A single drop of belladonna sap might dilate the eyes and help the patient breathe, but 3 drops could lead to eternal sleep. Healers learned to measure by sight, by memory, and by faith in handed-down experience. There were no precision scales, no standard recipes, only instinct, which was often the most dangerous tool of all. In the 12th century journal of Brother Theobald of Rhineland, there is a passage where he recalls prescribing medicine for a woman suffering from violent headaches caused by the cold air. He crushed some mandrake root, mixed it with wine, and prayed before offering it. The woman drank it, slept for 2 days, and then woke with the pain gone. But Theobald confessed in his journal, "I trembled through the night." Had the dose been more, she might never have returned, and I, rather than healer, would have been her killer. His words reveal the fear behind every decision, a fear few outside his craft could understand. This was a conscious risk. They knew the danger, but chose to act anyway because inaction meant watching a patient suffer or die in vain. Healers never placed full trust in the herbs, they trusted their own judgment. And it was that judgment that set them apart. A midwife daring to add a pinch of belladonna to calm seizures, an herbalist choosing to burn juniper smoke during a plague, a monk risking a few drops of mandrake sap to give a patient sleep. The community, of course, both relied on them and kept them at arm's length. When a cure worked, they were hailed as saviors, even likened to saints, but when a patient died, blame quickly followed. And not just professional blame, sometimes supernatural accusation. A failed remedy could be seen as witchcraft. A midwife might be accused of hiding spells in her medicine. A herbalist might be whispered about, he struck a deal with the devil, and that's why his patients die. Such rumors could shatter a reputation or lead to trial. So healers learned to guard their secrets. They never spoke dosages aloud, never revealed full recipes. Partly to protect their craft, but mostly to protect themselves. Theobald's journal mentions this as well. There are formulas I commit only to memory, for paper may fall into the wrong hands, and from it accusations may rise beyond the truth. Silence became their thin armor, one that made their work resemble magic as much as medicine. There was a bitter paradox. The better they were, the more they were distrusted. An herbalist who cured too many raised suspicion, why does he know so much? A midwife who helped women survive difficult births might be whispered about. She must have help from something unholy. Their precise, risky work, rather than earning admiration, often became evidence they had crossed some natural line. Yet it was that very work that kept communities alive. Without those willing to take risks, patients would die in pain with no hope. These healers were the earliest experimenters, the unnamed researchers. They wrote no theories, but through lived experience they laid foundations for the pharmacology we know today. Imagine an evening in a dirt-floored cottage. A patient groans, the family is tense. The healer enters, lights a candle, crushes herbs, boils them. When the bowl is offered, no one knows if it will heal or harm, but they give it, and the patient drinks. That fragile trust is what allowed people to survive centuries of plague and poverty. Today, when we read journals like Theobald's, what we see isn't a tale of sorcery, it's raw honesty. They were always afraid, and it was within that fear that they did their work, walking the tightrope between saving lives and risking death. This wasn't just early medicine, it was an art of risk where every decision was a step on the razor-thin edge between life and the unknown. Duoi jai la ban dich tieng an qua joan ban kung cap. So in the Middle Ages, seeing what others could not was either the greatest gift or a death sentence, a vision, a radiant dream, a voice echoing in the mind. It could be the word of God or the trickery of the devil. The question was how to tell the difference. And who had the authority to decide? The person who experienced it only knew they had felt something intense, beautiful, or terrifying, but the community, the church, and the courts held the power to label that experience divine or heretical. Many records describe monks falling into ecstatic states during prayer. They saw light flooding the room, heard songs not of this world, felt their bodies lift as if by invisible hands. To some it meant they had been chosen by God to be messengers, but to others, especially if the monk rose to fame too quickly, it raised suspicion. Was it truly God, or just an empty stomach and some strange mushrooms from dinner? There was a case in the 13th century northern Italy where a woman named Clara claimed to speak with angels during her fevers. She described a silver-winged being, comforting in voice, who urged her to spread a message of repentance. At first, the villagers listened and believed. But when Clara began repeating messages that displeased the local priest-like, the angel says women should be allowed to read scripture aloud at Mass, her visions were suddenly deemed sinful. She was summoned before the church court. They asked, "Are you sure it was an angel? Could it not have been a demon in disguise?" She replied, "I only know it was not the voice of man." With that answer, she was swiftly reclassified from saintly to possessed. In fact, many such experiences could be explained today through medicine. A high fever, mild ergot poisoning from rye bread, or the effects of henbane could produce vivid visual and auditory hallucinations. People would see radiant colors, hear phantom sounds, feel their bodies lift. But in the medieval world, these were never seen as neurological disturbances. They were seen as messages, and messages demanded interpretation. That interpretation could turn someone into a saint or into a witch. Imagine being a young monk in a monastery. One night you pray for so long that your mind begins to spin. You see the Virgin Mary appear and smile at you. You weep with joy. The next day you share the vision. Some nod with reverence. But if the bishop dislikes you, the story is quickly shut down. Be careful, Satan too can appear as an angel. Suddenly the smile you saw becomes a trap. The sacred becomes incriminating. A trial in Rhineland once recorded the case of a girl who claimed she had heard the voice of angels in the wind, promising her village would be spared from plague. When the plague came anyway, she was accused of deceiving the community, even of consorting with demons. The simple truth may have been that she'd eaten contaminated bread and truly believed in what she heard. But in an atmosphere of fear, innocent belief could become evidence of guilt. Not all hallucinations were punished. Some people, thanks to luck or social standing, were said to receive divine revelation. St. Hildegard of Bingen, for example, described strange visions full of light and form. She saw the universe ablaze, music turning into radiance, plants whispering the voice of God. Rather than being prosecuted, she was celebrated and is now revered as a theologian and composer. Perhaps because she was an abbess, educated and protected by powerful bishops. The same experience, but the label saint or heretic was determined by social context. Here, the work of healers and the authority of the church intersected. A dose of henbane could cause a patient to meet an angel, but if they described it the wrong way, that angel became a demon. Healers knew this and would often whisper a warning, "Drink this, but don't speak of what you see." It was wise advice because no one wanted an innocent vision to become a courtroom sentence. In the community space, visions were retold in hushed tones. "She saw St. Michael in the field," someone would whisper. Another would laugh. "Probably just too much strong wine." In a world where the line between sacred and dangerous was always blurred, interpretation often said more about the listener than the visionary. A vision could elevate a village's status or bring it unwanted attention from church authorities. Today, scientists might explain these episodes using neurological terms: hallucinations from acetylcholine inhibitors, trance states from sleep deprivation, or the combination of stress and darkness. But medieval people didn't need those terms. They only knew that sometimes humans saw beyond the ordinary, and so they named it, judged it, and decided what it meant. It was not the vision itself, but the interpretation that shaped a person's fate. Reading historical trials of those who spoke with angels in delirium brings both tragedy and irony. Tragedy because many truly believed in what they saw and were punished for that belief. Irony because their communities thought they could clearly separate the voice of God from the voice of the devil, when both may have been nothing more than a nervous system reacting to mold or spoiled grain. Even so, those visions left their mark on culture. They shaped how people understood revelation, sanctity, and the danger of misinterpretation. They remind us that in a world of scarcity, people still long to touch the divine, and sometimes that longing led them to the most beautiful landscapes of the mind or to the coldest courts of humanity. For the medieval peasant, what we today call hallucinogenic substances were neither secrets nor dangerous toys. They were simply part of the wooden chest or woven basket in the corner of the house, what they considered their family medicine cabinet. While clergymen and judges debated whether such things came from God or the devil, ordinary people just thought, "It helps me sleep, helps with the pain, helps the cow stand after falling ill." On a humble level, these herbs were woven into daily life just like onions, garlic, or a bunch of mint on the windowsill. In every village there were usually a few people who had a special knowledge of herbs, but even ordinary households had recipes passed down from mother to daughter. A handful of dried chamomile flowers steeped in hot water for stomach aches. A few caraway seeds chewed with bread to ease bloating. Even henbane leaves, dangerous if used incorrectly, had a role. They knew how to bind the leaf to an open wound, not to ingest it, and believed it would relieve pain and stop the bleeding. This knowledge wasn't found in books, but in late-night stories or in motherly advice given at a daughter's wedding. Remember, just one leaf, no more. In a smoke-darkened kitchen, you can imagine a mother stirring oat porridge, tossing in a few sprigs of bitter mugwort. No one saw this as mystical. It was simply a way to make the meal easier to digest, to help her husband sleep peacefully after a long day in the fields. If someone had a strange dream after dinner, they'd laugh and say, "Must have been too much mugwort in the pot." There were no great rituals, no church bells ringing, just a quiet acceptance that herbs carry both help and harm, and that the balance rests in the practiced hands of the woman in the kitchen. A folk recipe recorded from Bavaria says, "If a child cries all night, toast caraway seeds until golden, grind them, and mix with warm milk. After drinking, the child will sleep soundly." In the same notebook is a stern warning: never confuse caraway with hemlock seeds. That mistake could turn a remedy into a death sentence. This shows that common folk were not naive. They understood the thin line between healing and harm, and were so careful they made up rhymes for children to memorize. Keep the soft, sweet-smelling leaves, let the bitter, tough ones go. In the Mediterranean regions where grape wine was common, women often added herbs to wine jars, creating what we might call medicinal wine. A bit of rosemary for strength, some myrrh resin to ward off colds, and occasionally even tree resins with light hallucinogenic properties, making the drinker feel their mind opened. No one called it a ritual, it was simply a way to preserve wine and make it more useful during winter. But the mental effects, however small, were felt and remembered. Peasants also had tricks for safe consumption. They knew not to drink herb-laced wine before a day in the fields; it made limbs weak. They knew if someone drank too much, give them thick porridge with honey to weigh them down and help them sleep it off. They didn't use scientific explanations, but through observation, they formed unspoken rules. This knowledge was passed on in stories, just like fairy tales. Sometimes, during village festivals, people drank stronger beer than usual, and someone might stumble and claim they saw singing goats. Everyone would burst into laughter and lay the man down in a pile of straw. No one rushed to call it sorcery or demonic. To common folk, such experiences didn't need lofty definitions. They were just stories, part of living close to nature and relying on plants to survive. This quiet acceptance may have been what kept communities stable. They didn't need theological debates about where hallucinations came from. They only knew that a few leaves might save a mother in pain, that some roots could help an old man sleep before dying. And when a remedy failed, they rarely blamed the healer. Instead, they'd sigh and say, "Maybe the soil was bad this year and the plants turned." Blame fell on the land, not on the hands. Today, we can look back and see a kind of quiet wisdom in their methods. Ordinary people knew danger was always present, but they also knew that rejecting herbs entirely meant surrendering to pain. They chose the middle path, to use with care, to trust without blind faith. This quiet trust is what made folk knowledge endure through generations. No books, no church seals, just whispered advice at the hearth, in the fields, on winter nights, with the family huddled around a pot of soup. And when we read these folk remedies today, we may smile. They may not be precise by modern science, sometimes even risky, but in a world without industrial painkillers or on-call doctors, they were the best option. That humble, quiet acceptance reflects how medieval people faced their world, not by denying danger, but by refusing to be afraid of it. In the Middle Ages, something strange could appear anywhere. A feverish child suddenly rising to sing like an angel, a farmer falling ill but waking up claiming to have seen God, or an old woman lighting a bundle of dried leaves and insisting that the smoke carried her soul to the heavens. But what turned these moments into a miracle or a mischief? The answer didn't lie in the nature of the event, but in two factors: intent and the witnesses. If you did it in service of faith, and if the witnesses wanted to believe, it became a miracle. But if you acted out of curiosity, or if the witnesses had reason to doubt, you were suddenly accused of devilry. A man drinks wine infused with tree resin, sees a blinding light, and claims he hears sacred music. If he tells the story in church, he may be seen as someone blessed. But if he tells it in a noisy tavern with the smell of ale in the air, the tale becomes a joke or worse, proof that he's been playing with the devil. Same experience, but context completely shifts its meaning. Many records from ecclesiastical courts show just how crucial the witness could be. A woman claimed she saw the Virgin Mary while gardening. If local nuns heard her and offered support, the story could grow into a small pilgrimage site. But if the local priest felt threatened by the attention, he might call it a trick, forcing her to prove her vision, perhaps by repeating it in front of a crowd. And if she failed, she fell swiftly from miracle to deception. Intent was also scrutinized. A monk using belladonna to expand the mind before prayer might be praised as a spiritual seeker. But an old woman using the same plant to help a neighbor sleep could be accused of brewing enchantments. What changed wasn't the plant, but the story told about it. When it occurred within the framework of the church, it was holy. When it occurred in the folk kitchen, it became suspicious. This divide wasn't exclusive to Europe. In the Byzantine Empire, laws clearly distinguished between thaumaturgia, miracle working, and goetia, dark sorcery. A drop of holy oil might heal the sick, but a drop of oil infused with mysterious herbs was considered witchcraft. Byzantine clergy often debated the purity of intention. If the goal was to reach God, the act was acceptable. But if the goal was personal gain, it became sin. In the Islamic world at the same time, Sufi mystics sometimes used hashish to detach from the self and enter deep contemplation. Within the Sufi community, this was seen as sacred, but among Orthodox scholars it was viewed as a sign of deviation. A Sufi poem reads, "I shed myself like an old shoe, and in the smoke I heard his voice." To believers, it was revelation. To critics, it was indulgence. In China, belief in herbal medicines and elixirs also created a fragile boundary. Some emperors consumed immortality potions that included mercury and died young. If they recovered, the court physician called it healing by celestial means. If they died, it was poisoning. As in Europe, the story was shaped by power. Whoever held the authority to interpret an event decided where the line was drawn. Back in Europe, a striking example was the phenomenon of weeping statues. When a statue of the Virgin Mary was said to shed tears or blood, villagers flocked to witness the miracle. But if it happened in a village already in conflict with the bishop, the event could be dismissed as a hoax. The witnesses' villagers or clergy determined whether the miracle was allowed to exist. In 14th century Italy, there were even trials of the statues themselves to judge whether the event was genuine. Sometimes the statue was preserved in a church as a sacred relic. Other times it was hidden away as a suspected trick of demons. A common thread emerges: events carried no inherent meaning. Their significance existed only in the eyes of the community. A single tear might be a miracle or just condensation. A whisper could be an angel or just the wind. The witnesses decided the story that would be told, and those in power decided how long that story would live. Among the common folk, this created a particular attitude. They understood that strange occurrences were better kept private. If someone dreamed of light in the fields, they might tell their family, but not the priest. If they drank strong wine and saw strange visions, they'd laugh with their neighbors, but never make it public. Experience taught them that the same event, seen through different eyes, could become a crime. Today we might look back and see that medieval law wasn't so different from the rest of the world. Byzantine, Islamic, Chinese cultures all drew lines between miracle and magic, between revelation and sorcery. In every case, it was the community and its gatekeepers who decided what belonged on which side, and that reveals the fragility of human experience. A single moment of beauty could raise someone to sainthood or land them in court. For the medieval peasant, perhaps the wisest path was silence. They knew that miracle and mischief were separated only by a glance, a judgment. So instead of boasting, they kept it quiet, held the experience close shared only around the hearth. A world full of wonders and mischiefs, but only the stories told in the right place survived the centuries. Looking back at the long path we've just taken, the image of medieval Europe is not only one of storm-lashed castles, muddy roads, or meager meals. There's also a haze-like smoke drifting through the kitchen, where people sought moments of escape from reality through leaves, roots, wine, or incense. Getting high, in modern terms, wasn't a mere indulgence, but a part of survival, ritual, and collective imagination. In daily life, these herbs were simply part of the medicine cabinet. Henbane soothed pain, mandrake aided sleep, belladonna was carefully used to reduce spasms. For common folk, they weren't mystical, they were necessary tools for navigating a world without aspirin, without night shift doctors, without hospitals. Yet these tools always carried a trace of the extraordinary. A slightly too strong dose turned sleep into hallucination. A sip of special wine could turn a buzz into a journey to the divine. In ritual, these substances became doorways. Monks burned incense to evoke sacred atmosphere. Sufis used hashish to forget the self. Ancient Egyptians burned frankincense to summon the gods. In Europe, a bit of resin in wine or an herbal salve on the skin was believed to send the soul traveling to fly, to ascend, or to glimpse what couldn't be seen with earthly eyes. For communities living in uncertainty, such journeys offered faith, comfort, or simply brief relief from the burdens of life. In imagination, these plants became stories passed down by the fireside. Mandrake screams when uprooted. Bees produce mad honey to trick invading armies. The dancers of the dancing plague were said to be under divine possession. These tales, grounded in real experiences, quickly became collective memory, not only as explanations but as teachings for the next generation. Children learned some plants should never be touched bare-handed, some honey must be eaten with care. In this way, the hallucinations of ancestors became the knowledge of descendants. When we place medieval Europe alongside other civilizations, we see a common thread. Everywhere, humans sought to reach beyond themselves through leaves, smoke, or spirits. Everywhere, the line between miracle and mischief, revelation and illusion, was fragile. And everywhere there were keepers of knowledge, those who remembered, told, and passed it on so the next generation wouldn't walk blindly into darkness. Today, parts of that legacy still remain. Chamomile, fennel, rosemary, all are still in the herbal tea you can buy at any supermarket. The idea of mind-opening aromas has become the modern essential oils industry. The dream books and herbals of the medieval world are the direct ancestors of today's pharmacopoeias. Even folk warnings, don't eat strange mushrooms in the forest, don't drink unknown infused liquors, still hold value. Modern science has replaced belief, but cultural memory still holds pieces of a time when plants could nourish or challenge us. There's a quiet irony here. What was once called magic is now chemistry. Scopolamine in belladonna, atropine in henbane, ergotamine in moldy rye. All have been isolated, measured, and used in modern medicine. What was once a potion is now a prescription. But in a village in the year 1200, such distinctions didn't exist. There was only one truth: a plant could heal or kill, and the choice rested in the hands of the user. So what, in the end, did getting high mean in the Middle Ages? Perhaps it wasn't rebellion as we think of it today. It wasn't for fun, but for survival, for faith, for connection. A drop of honey, a wisp of smoke, a sip of wine, they offered moments that the harshness of daily life couldn't provide. They allowed people to believe there was more than just the frozen fields and the hunger of winter. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy, not the precise recipes, not the chemical compounds, but the human ability to look into leaves and smoke and see another world. That ability, no matter what we call it, miracle, mischief, hallucination, or science, still exists. And it reminds us that imagination at times is its own form of medicine. As we close this story, let's return to the opening scene. A small kitchen, hazy with smoke, the sharp scent of herbs in the air, a pot of wine bubbling on the hearth. Outside, the winter wind howls across the thatched roof. But inside there is warmth, belief, and a way out. Just a sip, a breath, and that world opens up. A world far away and yet, somehow, just within reach. And that brings us to the end of tonight's journey. We've seen how a sip of ale, a whiff of smoke, or a pinch of herb could turn a medieval night into something both dangerous and divine. For common folk, it was survival. For healers, it was measured risk. For priests, it was a question of saint or sinner. History rarely leaves us with answers. But it does leave traces in recipes, in warnings, in whispers that drifted from one generation to the next. A reminder that even the most ordinary lives were lived in a haze of hopes, fears, and dreams. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me on Historian's Sleepy 365. If you'd like more journeys like this, you can always subscribe and return whenever you need a calm companion. For now, let your eyes close, let the voices of the past fade, and may the silence of the night take over.